Greetings, everyone. In this video, I'll be focusing primarily on childhood and relationship trauma, which is considered small t trauma, but is also the most common kind that we experience. Reassess the actual events, the actual trauma. Look at it very carefully at the facts, not your imagination or the emotions. Don't get consumed in over-emotion. Just look at the facts. What actually happened? You can draw it on a piece of paper or in a note application and type out your side of the story and their side of the story in bullet point form and just write down certain events like they said this, I said this, or I didn't say this, and I wanted to say this. Then this happened, and this happened, then this happened, and this happened. In my case, for myself, it would look like this. I would write down two people. I would say, okay, so-and-so said, one night, a year after we broke up, they gave me this cruel sarcasm. And then 5 minutes later, another bullet point. They violently snapped in my face. And then in the same month, they were moody again, and I wish that I said this, and I wish that I asked them why they're still being rude to me. I wish I was more honest, imposing, and outspoken. And then I heard that they said this about me, and then I wished on my side that I talked about that, and that's it. Look at all these events and add them up together. Look at your side, look at their side. Now that you have the scale of what actually happened, ask yourself if it's really that severe. Was it really that unfair? Those are the events. But also look at the karma too. Look at the suffering that the other person went through. If they were suffering greatly, even though all this stuff happened to you, maybe you want to just let this thing go. Some dumb thing that happened to you when you were so young and so unprepared. You have to forgive yourself because you couldn't have expected yourself to be the best version of yourself back then, because life happens, right? Don't be so hard on yourself if you didn't know how to handle the problem back then. You did handle the situation as best as you could for the time. Good enough is good enough. When we find ourselves in an emotionally stable mood and we carefully reflect on our problems very objectively by going over the facts, the list of events that we wrote down, we can surprise ourselves. The situation may have actually been more fair than we thought. Maybe we were selectively remembering, because that definitely happens. When we're bombarded with a lot of crap and we get shocked, we selectively remember. When a relationship takes a turn very quickly because of a betrayal or conflict, it can become so overwhelming that we just remember and obsess over the very negative events. And the complicated thing about youth trauma is that when it happens when you're very young, you were probably not at all prepared for it, and maybe you didn't know how to talk about it with your friends or your parents. Maybe it was actually your parents that harmed you, or maybe you kept putting off getting help from a professional. So very unfortunately, you ended up carrying this trauma with you for years, and it significantly shaped your childhood or youth and your personality. It put your life on a completely different course. And you carried this weight on your shoulders for years. Maybe you were thinking to yourself that as the years go by, things are just getting worse and worse. And you just keep dragging this with you. It's so easy to look back on those painful memories and just find yourself so utterly confused and angry or depressed, in tears over just the amount of time that's gone by. And you think to yourself, I've been carrying this weight on my shoulders for 8 years now. My life has been ruined. It feels like I'm just starting from nothing now that it's almost over. And this idea that you've wasted your life living with fear or being angry and vengeful all the time is very sad. But here are some things to keep in mind. For some of us, if we're lucky enough, if we really look at the quality of life that we've lived up until now, and where our attention has been going up until now, you might be surprised to find that most of the time, you are getting by quite well. Half the time, or even 3/4 of the time that you've been living with this past trauma, you were actually very occupied. Your attention was not even immersed in the very sensations related to the trauma. Let's say you've been angry for 8 years or 9 years, very angry and confused, very damaged for 9 years. Well, it's not like every second that went by, every waking second, you're angry for 9 years. That's almost impossible. If you look back on your life, the first 4 years, likely, you were very angry or upset. Let's take anger, for example, because some people are traumatized with other feelings. So you were very angry about half the time because it was a very strong trauma and it was fresh. But the last 4 years you've been living with it, you may have been getting by quite well, living a reasonably good quality life, maybe just experiencing brief bouts of anger or upset every now and then. The last 2 years, it was probably almost gone. So much of our attention is actually being demanded all the time by other people, work duties. You're sleeping 1/3 of that time. So really, that 1/3 was spent in distraction. So if you review your life and you look at this 7 or 10-year span of being deeply affected, it looks very lofty because you've been living with this pain for such a long time. Maybe you were weeping just the other day, reflecting on that fact. Well, when I looked back at my 9 years of being angry and confused and frustrated and feeling damaged, I realized that out of those 9 years, the amount of time that I actually spent immersed in those negative feelings only added up to about 2.5 years, when you look at it precisely like that. This was based on how much I sleep, how often I get distracted. So from that point of view, I thought to myself, all right, what's 2.5 years out of my life? So you were burdened by this karma, as we all are. And for the next while, you dragged this mental burden with you. It may have stuck with you for almost a decade, like in my case. But another thing I want to point out is that these ordeals tend to affect us the most for the first few years. So our life takes a detour for a while, but after some time, a lot of us get used to the lifestyle of being a traumatized or damaged person. In many cases, the severity of the side effects from trauma decreases in a curve that looks something like this. You can see how all the shock and the effects are most strong in the beginning, of course, and then the side effects of that trauma are carried for a while, and gradually you reach a point where you've gotten kind of used to this lifestyle of being a traumatized and damaged person. And so things don't change too much. Doesn't seem to be getting much worse, doesn't seem to be getting any better. We're stubborn about it. After a long while, after many years, we tend to feel as though we've wasted so much time feeling miserable. And at that point, it either gets worse or it gets better because we've gotten so used to it. And then it tapers off very quickly. Another thing that may be worth considering is the time or age when the trauma happened to you. So a childhood trauma that happens when you're really young, like around 5 and 12 years old, can be devastating and really leave a lasting impression on someone. So when that person grows up, they can't easily give themselves another chance at enjoying their childhood and certain childhood activities because they're an adult now. So it would end up feeling very awkward to try to relive your childhood as an adult. And this was the case for Michael Jackson because his dad trained him so often and rigorously as a pop star dancer and singer that Michael regretted never having the time to enjoy his childhood the way most other kids did, with play dates and sleepovers and things like that. That's part of the reason why he created Never Never Land. He said in his interviews that he always wished that he had a more typical childhood. But let's say you had a good childhood, and then something happened to you a bit later on, like in your late teens or even your 20s. Then in those other spaces of time, those other periods of time when you were a little kid or in your early 20s, you could say that you had a relatively good life up until that obstruction, that trauma. So if what happened to you occurred in your late teens or even 20s, then you were more or less already an adult at that point. So you still have your whole life to enjoy all the things that people do in their adult years. It's not like you would feel the need to relive your teen years and set up a sleepover with a friend because that wasn't the part of your life that was disturbed. The thing about the lifestyle of an adult is that it doesn't necessarily change that much as time goes by. So once you're an adult for a very long time. Whereas childhood comes and goes very quickly, and likewise, our lifestyle changes very quickly. So when I compare the lifestyle of a 21-year-old to the lifestyle of a 35-year-old, there often isn't any difference. They're both adults. They both rent places to live, since housing is so expensive here at least. They both go out to bars and clubs, and they both work day jobs until one of them finds their career path. So maybe your late teens or early 20s weren't very enjoyable because something really bad happened to you around that time, but you have your whole life ahead of you. My early 20s definitely could have been better if I hadn't contaminated that period of my life with anger. But on the bright side, I can say that I've had a very good childhood and enjoyed much of my teen years up until that point. So how do people heal from trauma? Why is it that some of us seem to be getting worse and worse over time, escaping and getting addicted to various activities like video games and alcohol? This problem is growing in them. And for some of us, it's as though our wound, which was bleeding and tender, eventually turned into a dry, shriveled up scab that one day flaked right off. Well, of course, we have to consider the severity of what happened to the person. That's obviously going to make a difference. But I was thinking about certain people who had undergone traumas in their life, like war veterans. And what came to my mind was that woman in the Titanic. In the original movie, the scenes would alternate between the tragic past, when the ship sank, and the present. And what came to my mind was the old woman who was telling the story, but by that age, she was already well healed. So those past events had become something like a legend that she lived through. It was a very long time ago, and it was no longer affecting her. There are a few things that people who've healed from very terrible things in their life have in common. One of them is their attitude and perspective. How these interpersonal and emotional circumstances in your life affect you are really a matter of perspective. Some people can handle a difficult person without reacting or taking it too personally or seriously. Maybe they're not that emotional to begin with, or they think, well, it's not my problem, or I get it, the other person's like that and they can't seem to control themselves, but I'm used to it. And in contrast, many of us get our feathers really ruffled up easily. We all have our own perspective and tolerance level. Now, people who are traumatized tend to, of course, focus on the heaviest, most painful things that are bothering them. They can't seem to help it, and no matter how hard they try, they just can't deny what happened to them. Sometimes we're so weighed down when we wake up in the morning, we feel so depressed, we don't have any motivation to get out of bed, or maybe we've woken up from a dream about the person who hurt us. When you keep waking up like that after a number of years, you think to yourself, my God, what happened to me? What happened to my life? My life has been full of struggle and misery this whole time. How long have I been living with this? It could have been better. That thing shouldn't have happened. It could have been avoided. My life is ruined. And we get very fixated and attached to that notion of our story. And that's not surprising because the human condition is predisposed for survival and desire. We are basically idealists and hedonists by nature. We're not stoics or ascetics. Most of us don't go out looking to struggle in painful situations so that we can train ourselves to become more resilient. We would prefer to have everything in the world. We would prefer that everything was just right and perfect. And that's one of our problems. We don't know how to receive suffering. And we always think that suffering is a bad thing. But it's not. And I'll explain why toward the end of this video. Another thing we should consider is just how much awareness we have about the things that are going on in this planet. Are we putting things into perspective? Because if you look around at the things that are happening to people, not just in second and third world countries, but right here at home, you will see the reality. The reality is that in this day and age, suffering is more pervasive than it ever has been. So we may be able to create the perfect life that we want, the most ideal thing that we've dreamt of, but usually not without having to go through something very difficult like child abuse in the mixture, you see. These things are happening more and more over the century because that is the karma of this planet. It's been getting worse ever since the 1950s. The quality of life. If you pay attention and look around, it doesn't take long before you notice how pervasive suffering is. It's in the lyrics of all the music we hear. And if you don't believe the suffering music, just listen to all the rock bands out there. Just listen to all the rock music, all the metal music especially. Look into the lyrics of bands like Korn, Bring Me the Horizon, Nine Inch Nails. Jonathan Davis from Korn, for example, was physically abused, sexually assaulted at a very early age, and bullied much of the time in school. So his ordeals were so heavy that he was able to found his entire career on that, on his suffering. Some of these rock musicians these days have the worst psychological health in spite of their material fame and success. So who do you know who is suffering right now? Every second person you meet has been through at least one great thing that totally overwhelmed them. 1 in 4 people in North America regularly experience acute anxiety, including panic attacks, and they take prescription medication for them. And that same ratio applies to depression too. How many people do you know have chronic irritable bowel syndrome or get migraines regularly or are depressed for no reason and they've always had that? All the pain we see in this world is supposed to happen, And that's because we are at that time. If you read books like Aquarian Message or The Doomed Aryan Race by Samael Aounbala, it all comes together and it's explained. So let's face the reality. You're not alone. Getting back to things that healed people have in common, the healed person was somehow able to shift their perspective and look at their life from a different point of view. Maybe they got counseling, or maybe it was partially time that made them better. Many of these healed people also came up with some form of compensation for their past hardship. Many great musicians chose to compensate themselves and take advantage of their tragedies by becoming prolific artists. So instead of waking up depressed all the time and reminiscing on the past, how many of us begin to place our attention on the future and willfully visualize a healed version of ourselves 2 years from now, 4 years from now, or 5 years from now, imagining ourselves like that old woman in the Titanic, telling our story with total indifference, without aversion, living our new life on a clean slate. What would you look like? How would you express yourself? Where would you be working? What people would you be with? What would your routine be like? Now, getting into time, when you give yourself the time to heal, you give yourself a chance to circulate new energy. There are 3 basic kinds of energy in the universe: stagnant, circulating, and integrating. When we're very emotionally hurt, we need some time for ourselves to recover the emotional body so that we can integrate ourselves again. And once we feel like ourselves again, we've, for the most part, integrated. It's probably the case for most of us that we're all well past the initial shock of our traumas. But once we learn proper healing techniques, then we can go back for a period of time to heal more thoroughly. If we stay in a cave for too long, then our energy and routine become stagnant. This is the time we should circulate new energy. Any new activity or routine can do this for us, and this will create new impressions in your mind, new memories, new sensations. And this is important because we want to stop associating certain people, places, activities, or things with the bad memories. We essentially want to create good memories. Some people feel the urge to move to a different city to get away from their hometown and all the bad memories it carries. And if that's the yearning you have, go ahead, do it. And go out, take up new hobbies and activities, meet new people. This will help refresh your mind. Now, here's something very astonishing about time. According to scientists, time in the linear sense doesn't exist. So what we think of as time is really just slices of now that we create every moment when we think about or believe in the past or future. Just because we have an audio recording or video capture of something in the past doesn't prove its existence in the past. What's really going on is, in the present moment, we've created circumstances and causes that allow us to observe what we think and label as a previously recorded event in linear time. But the reality is, the recording that we're seeing and hearing is happening in the now, and there was no past to create it. Only a series of nows. Really, all time is happening at once. The past and future only exist in the 5th dimension, not in the 4th dimension of time. They exist in hyperspace. And these sections of time only become a reality for us when we activate their respective parallel universes by thought or memory. Every time we remember the past or imagine the future, Everything exists in the eternal present and can be accessed and experienced anytime with the right shift in consciousness. But by themselves, neither the past nor future exist. In Eckhart Tolle's renowned book, The Power of Now, he explains, when you remember the past, you activate a memory trace, and you do so now. The future is an imagined now, a projection of the mind. When the future comes, it comes as the now. When you think about the future, you do it now. Past and future obviously have no reality of their own. Interesting, right? He also explains that when you become present and access the now, you open up a portal and dissolve the past. That portal he mentions is hyperspace, the fifth dimension. When your awareness becomes very present and you remove yourself from your burden of memories and overthinking, you separate from your current timeline reality and enter hyperspace. Since you're not thinking about them, the events from the past disappear from your present reality and lay dormant in a state of potential, along with all the thousands of other parallel universes in hyperspace. All these other worlds still exist in parallel worlds, but you are no longer part of any one particular timeline reality. Everything is up in the air and you become free until you recall a specific memory, trauma, or idea about the future. By remaining present, you separate yourself from any history or future. This is a scientific fact. I personally find that fact enormously liberating because it means that the weight that I've been carrying on my shoulders for so long, for years, never existed, technically speaking. Here is another very strange fact. When you are present, there is no correlation between the past and the now, or the old you and the present you. So in Eckhart Tolle's words, he said, "Nothing ever happened in the past. It happened in the now. Nothing will ever happen in the future. It will happen in the now. What you think of as the past is a memory trace, stored in the mind of a former now. When you remember the past, you reactivate a memory trace, and you do so now. The future is an imagined now, a projection of the mind. When the future comes, it comes as the now. When you think about the future, you do it now. Past and future obviously have no reality of their own. Just as the moon has no light of its own, but can only reflect the light of the sun. So our past and future are only pale reflections of the light, power, and reality of the eternal present. Their reality is borrowed from the now. The essence of what I'm saying here cannot be understood by the mind. The moment you grasp it, there's a shift in consciousness from mind to being, from time to present. Suddenly, everything feels alive, radiates energy, emanates being. Speaking of which, who says we have to limit our perception of time based on age? Speaking of which, who says we have to limit our perception of time based on age? There's a company out there called Inside Tracker that offers numerous kits that can track something called biological age and show us how old our bodies really are. You might think that a lot of time has gone by, but if your body says otherwise, then you've been living like an elf. Now let us go deeper into the subject of trauma by looking at the causes, the karma. The word karma comes from the root karman, which means action. But the translation for karma is cause and effect. That is the meaning. What we know in Isaac Newton's third law of physics is that there cannot be some action without an equal and opposite reaction, because everything in the universe is a form of energy, from physical things to sound and light. And as Albert Einstein pointed out, energy cannot be destroyed. You can't create more energy than you already have, and you cannot remove or destroy it. Energy can only change from one state to another. So every action has a consequence of some sort, even if that action is just a subtle thought or emotion. The physical world, after all, is a result of our internal world, the quality of our mind. So we have to be personally accountable for our problems in life. As strange as it might seem for me to say that your greed and pride, for example, attracted somebody who would criticize you and provoke your anger and greed, this is how it works. The most significant relationship or family circumstances arise because of soul ties, which are karmic. There are subtle vibrations in your mind that will attract certain kinds of people into your life, like a magnet. The sad part is that these traumas we go through are not the first time we've experienced them. The best and worst situations we go through with the people around us have usually been recurring for dozens of lifetimes, even as far back as the times of Egypt. This happens because of Newton's third law, action and reaction, or invariance. So to be trapped in a strong karmic bond with someone like this is very tragic, as you and the other person have been taking turns suffering from a quarrel that began a very long time ago. Try to feel compassion for the other person, because in their previous life, they were in the same position you were. Now, this is much easier when we use meditation to show us that kind of wisdom and insight. But even without meditation, we can still reflect on the other person's circumstances and suffering. Were they suffering at all when you knew them? What about their history? What about now? I was so angry about the criticism and the bad attitude I received, as well as very frustrated by my own confusion and overthinking. I was confused by her polar opposite behavior because I just didn't realize that she could be like that, so cold and angry and rude for no particular reason. I thought our breakup fiasco lasted for about a year, but after some contemplation, I realized that our problem was basically over after a few months. What I didn't realize was that she's always been a temperamental person, and it just took a while for me to see the worst of her. So that careful reflection really helped me understand the whole problem. Furthermore, in my case, I was able to observe the suffering that she underwent in this life. Not so much from our breakup quarrel, but just in general. If you could put our lives on both sides of a scale, it would be hard to say who suffered more. On one hand, I ended up ruining my life with anger for 9 years, and not being able to enjoy time with friends or lovers because of it. On the other hand, the person that hurt me had been living with chronic depression ever since she was about 6 years old. And I know, because of what her latter partners have explained, that she continues to experience this. If you look around at all the people with unexplainable depression, you'll see that it's mostly a water sign phenomenon. I've researched a lot of people who struggle with ongoing depression. And when you look at their astrology, when you look at what's called tattvas in Hinduism, and the 4 to 5 skandhas, you see these different elements, right? These people belong mostly to the water element. And you look at these people with depression, the water element always shows up somewhere in the sun or moon sign. In my case, she was a fire sign, but her moon sign had a Pisces cusp. So it was Aquarius and Pisces together. Robin Williams and Chester Bennington both had Pisces cusps. Chester was a Pisces-Aries mixture and the sun sign. Robin Williams, I can't remember if it was in the sun or the moon, but he had a Pisces-Aquarius cusp. And these people were both chronically depressed, just like my ex-partner, in the same way, since childhood. So in my reflection, I could see that the pain that the both of us went through was about the same. So my situation was a lot more fair than I originally thought. If you're spiritually inclined, one of the most important virtues you need to develop in order to heal wounds and grow spiritually is compassion. Compassion is the highest form of love. Cultivate compassion for all beings, including those who harm. The reason why we can forgive bad people is because nobody is aware of the harm they're causing both to others and themselves. Nobody believes that they will have to pay and suffer for their wrong actions, but we know this and should feel a genuine concern for others. The 6 realms of existence in Buddhism are real places that we find ourselves trapped in according to our actions and the quality of our mind. Every problem we're faced with is caused by ourself alone. The mind is the root cause of all problems. This is a fundamental truth in spirituality, and it can be hard to admit. When we're coping with anger, for example, we always think that the other person is at fault. But that's almost never the case with soul ties or twin flames. There was a master from a long time ago who explained this truth in a simple example. He said, if somebody comes over to you and deliberately strikes you with a stick, who do you get angry at? Do you get angry at the stick? You get angry at the person, right? But if the stick struck you, then maybe you should get angry at the stick. But if you take another step back, if you place yourself in that situation, then that means that it was your fault. So then, who should we get mad at? The moral is that anger is always short-sighted. And if you trace back the causes of an event far back enough, you will always find that the root cause is the mind itself. Ignorance, craving, and aversion. When we deeply comprehend this, then we see that it is not the other person we should be angry at. From that point, we should be more motivated to work on reducing our own defects of pride and anger and so on. If you know anything about anger in particular, it's a useless trait. The stress hormones that circulate through the body when we're angry damages the nervous system over time. That adrenaline we sometimes feel, that weakness and shaking in our legs we get when we're stressed. And any kind of stress like anger makes the digestive system shut down so that blood can go to the vital organs, which leaves us unable to make patient, precise, rational decisions. That's why we do and say ruthless things when we're angry. Try to forgive yourself. Perfectionism is a meticulous, proud trait. Maybe you went through a bad breakup, but you don't have to prove anything to the other person. Realize that most people know your worth. We're all humans, so we all function at relatively the same skill level. What do you have to prove to people? Knowing your worth is as simple as being a human being, maintaining a job, and having some hobbies and goals. We're all doing something with our life. What do you have to prove? a certain ability that you didn't demonstrate or express well when you two were together. There were a lot of little skills that I could have done better when I was with my previous partner, had I prepared. I could have been more articulate, I could have had a more expanded vocabulary, and I definitely could have stood up for myself with more assertiveness. But for me personally, all these little skills that I could have proven were not worth showing off. And I had too much pride in small things. And I would argue especially that people who are not compatible with you, people who you're not close friends with, are not worth revisiting just so you can prove something to them. When you're in your late teens or early 20s and still new to dating, for example, it's easy to become proud of your first job promotion or your first car or your first condo. But I suggest not becoming proud of these things and wanting to show them off to your ex-partners because, in my opinion, it's not really worth it and it can become bothersome even. All of us will eventually get those things anyway. Maybe it feels good if your exes also like status or nice cars. But if they don't have the same taste as you do, then you won't impress them much because they're not interested in the same things. This is a really typical Capricorn thing. They get struck by some terrible ordeal when they're young, some kind of betrayal, and they become extremely angry and overwhelmed. But they realize they don't have a natural ability to express themselves or speak up. This is an earth sign trait because earth is a very rigid element and it doesn't carry a lot of emotion. Earth signs tend to lack practice in self-expression. Now that I mentioned this, I should also point out that Libras also struggle tremendously with speaking up when they're young because of the predisposition with fairness, balance, harmony, and compromise. So when these problems happen in our youth, we often don't know how to handle it with our voice because we've never really used it. We don't know how to exert force in our speech or explain our thoughts or anger, or we get insecure about expressing ourselves because we're perfectionists and we don't want people to see us in the wrong way. We don't want to be labeled as overly emotional or dramatic or immature or selfish for getting angry. But then, consequently, we look back and think to ourselves, oh no, why did I hesitate to act? Why did I keep silent? That was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to fight back, to be assertive, to say no, that's wrong. Some of us just want to explode when we're provoked, just to prove our anger to others. But the attitude toward anger and vengeance that we buy into in popular culture is just that, a very traditional mindset. What difference would it have made if you had just said to the person, no, it's wrong, can't do this, or you told them off once or twice during the conflict? Well, maybe that would have made all the difference, or maybe not. But if you were dealing with a friendship or romantic relationship, you probably dealt with the person enough and did what you could. Good enough is good enough. From my experience, I learned how frustrating it can be to be confused in a relationship when you don't understand what's going on with the other person. We wonder why people do and say certain things around us, and we don't always know what the other person meant. We don't communicate enough about it, and then some time goes by and it's too late, everything is said and done, and we're left with a lot of questions like, what was that? What just happened? What did they mean by that thing they said about me? Let's take narcissistic relationships, for example. In these relationships, the person who has to put up with the narcissist is the empath, because they end up giving more attention to the other person and doing more for them. The person who has to put up with the narcissist is the empath, because they end up giving more attention to the other person and doing more for them. Now, if you look at the trend in most narcissist empath relationships, you'll see that the empath is always a very detail-oriented person. These people tend to be fastidious and perfectionist, so they notice the slightest body language you show them, and due to their perfectionism, they tend to overthink the things people do and say because they're overly concerned about what others think. All you have to do to get an empath second-guessing themselves or worrying about what they said is just repeat what they said while cocking an eyebrow as if in doubt. And very quickly they start changing their mind or even apologizing. So the struggle is that young empaths are softer in the head and they have weaker personal boundaries. They can say something that is very sound and reasonable, but as soon as you question them, they quickly think twice and question their own opinion. In some cases, narcissists take advantage of this and do something called gaslighting, which is where the narcissist covertly manipulates their partner's perspective for their own benefit. Empaths are the most critical thinkers, so they can put 2 and 2 together pretty well. A little too well for their own good, actually. They double think, triple think. Oh, what do they mean by that? Why are they doing this? Maybe it's a scheme. They think things like that, and I know this is true because when you look up the astrology among the partners in narcissistic relationships, most of the time the narcissist has more masculine energy in their sun or moon signs, whereas the empath has more feminine energy in those planets. Feminine zodiac signs are the ones that tend toward perfectionism, critical thinking, overthinking, rigidity, and empathy. Those traits are prominent because feminine energy is designed for nurturing and child rearing. Likewise, feminine signs are stable, stay-at-home people, who are not as likely to cheat in relationships as much as people with a lot of masculine energy. These are all facts that you can observe in people. Empaths also tend to express pettiness because of how observant they are. The more attention a person places on details, the harder it is for them to prioritize the more substantial things in life. So my point behind the narcissist-empath dichotomy is that if you were the empath in the relationship, there were probably a lot of things the person said to you or about you that you worried too much about. The person I was with once said to me, "I don't see you and I together." And later down the road, I found out that she regrets sleeping with me, too. And because of how unspecific these statements were, how vague they were, it drove me absolutely insane, not knowing exactly what she meant by these statements, or why she felt that way. My best advice is that in any case, you never need to think too hard about what people say about you. Just realize that humans develop in relatively the same way, and we all have the same needs and wants and insecurities. When someone says something about you, but you don't know what they mean, your first and most reasonable guess is most likely the right one. If you keep thinking and analyzing and theorizing about what someone said about you, you'll just end up generating a lot of outrageous conspiracy theories. In my case, I spent years overthinking what she said, only to find out that my first few guesses were right. Because I eventually learned how to meditate, and I went over the events and found myself reassured in meditation that my past assumptions were correct. When I was going through this conflict with this person, I didn't understand her much of the time. I've never met someone who could get so annoyed and uncomfortable around me that they have to ignore me even when I'm standing right next to them and I say something to them. I didn't quite understand why she was criticizing me behind my back. I just had the feeling that she was complaining about me out of her annoyance. I couldn't believe the terrible attitude that came out of nowhere. So I was overthinking throughout that whole phase. I also came to realize that my theories about this situation were a bit absurd and created by my own paranoia. The criticism wasn't too severe. It could have been worse. It could have been deliberate, but it wasn't. She wasn't dragging the fiasco into the next year. It's just that she's always been generally moody and rude, and I just didn't know that she could be that bad. I've just never seen the worst side of her. Maybe you were thinking the same thing. Well, if they said this, then why did they do that? And if they were rude to me one day, then why were they acting like nothing happened the next day? Oh, because number one, they don't really feel like apologizing. They know they're difficult like that. And two, I didn't give them a reaction. So they probably thought that I didn't notice, or just thought that I was used to that kind of treatment. We have the power to choose how we receive situations. Just because you were in a narcissistic relationship doesn't mean that you fell victim to the other person. When we're dealing with narcissists and they're saying rude things to us, we can choose to ignore them. It may not be easy at first, but it's possible. We don't always have to feel like a victim. Master Samael postulated, how can one accept an insult if there is no defect of pride to receive it? In other words, what other people think and say about you is irrelevant if you don't carry the qualities in your mind that react to those things. This is a beautiful realization. Of course, we all struggle to maintain that level of indifference and serenity around people. But that's the goal for someone who is devoted to raising their consciousness. When you've suffered enough with your grudges and anger, then you begin to realize just how much suffering there really is in holding on to bitterness and vindictiveness and resentment. We think the other person deserves prison, but we are also in prison and need to be set free from our pride and anger and vengeance and depression. Did the person ever say sorry to you at least once during your conflict with them? Did they ever try to do better? It took me numerous times of reflecting on my trauma before I remembered the order of events that played out. And I realized that, yeah, I guess there were a couple times when they tried to do better, when they said sorry, but I was so upset by my vindications that I wasn't fully aware of it. You can tell people that what they're doing is wrong and that they should stop. Once or twice is enough. But at the end of the day, you can't really control what people do or say or think of you. So it's better that we make ourselves more prepared and resilient to outside circumstances. For students of spirituality, it's not our job to control and change other people. All the beings in this world have free will. So if others choose to do harm or cause trouble, it's their will and it's also their problem. And they will have to pay for their consequences. When you're young, a trauma might happen to you, and at first, you may not understand, or you might think that you can handle it, that you can just let it go. But this is the first time that it's happened to you. And then your mind dwells on the events, and later on, gradually you realize what happened, but it's too late to turn back. So the trauma grows heavier and heavier as you realize that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do something about it, to stand up for yourself, to fight back, to use your voice, but you didn't. You hesitated. When you go through something horrible like child abuse or sexual abuse, or something overwhelming like bullying over the long term, or a terrible betrayal, or being cheated on, tradition says that you're supposed to speak out, to fight back, to take revenge. But when we fail to do this, we suffer even more. And for us, it's just too much to handle, too much to let go all at once. This is what life is like without proper holistic healing practices for the mind. Our minds are so conditioned that the only way to feel better is if we do something just as bad to the other person. But we need other ways and better ways to heal, because traumas are very common. Most of the time, we're helpless. The good news is there is a solution. There is one great benefit and necessity in suffering. That is spiritual growth. Nobody wants to undergo trauma. Nobody wants to admit that they carry a miserable past that ruined their childhood for almost a decade or longer. But remember, the only way to progress spiritually, the only way to grow the conscience, is to remove the conditioning that it carries. And that process is always painful. Any creature or soul with a conditioned mind, with ego, carries karma. And when we pay that karma, we do so through suffering. This is something we should be grateful for. The Buddha said that all pain comes from desire, and all happiness comes from serving others. For many lifetimes, we have put energy into motion by feeding desire, so that's why we feel the consequences of our previous actions. His Holiness the Dalai Lama interviewed a monk who was exiled from Tibet after the Chinese had invaded. This monk was imprisoned for 15 years and beaten and tortured. He went through the conflict and struggles of that time and place. The Dalai Lama asked, "What was your greatest danger when in prison?" And the monk's response was, "Losing my compassion for the Chinese." So you can imagine how devoted he was to maintaining upright view and love and compassion for others in such a treacherous time of his life. And somewhere in the interview, Dalai Lama said to the monk that it would have been easier to practice spirituality in that prison than to practice here at home at the meditation retreat. When I first began meditating on my youth trauma, after a few insights, my intuition told me through dream text, the consciousness needs something to feel. And Master Samael explained a similar thing. A mind that is at service of one's real being results in an effective instrument. The mind is made to be receptive, not as an active instrument. If someone hurts us, we must not permit the mind to react. Wish that there will always be someone who can hurt us in our feelings daily, so we can in that way train our mind better to be passive. The more insults we receive, the better for our training. Keep in mind, the pain of paying karma doesn't last very long. When you compare it to the millions of lives you've already lived, enlightenment can be attained in one life after all. You're watching this video because you already went through the pain of childhood trauma, and that's one of the worst experiences most people go through these days. So now that you're almost past that, it's just a matter of digesting those impressions from the past so that you can move forward again. We all have to work on ourselves at some point. How can you work on your pride if you've been feeding it your whole life and can't remember any time when you didn't stand up for yourself or embarrass yourself? How can you work on your sorrow and grief if you've never failed miserably at something or lost a loved one? Meditation is the right thing to do. It is the proper way to heal the mind. It is the way our mind was intended to function, with serenity and alertness. Meditative comprehension expands the consciousness. As your awareness expands, a lot of amazing things happen. You begin to see the bigger picture in life and find it easier to prioritize the things that really matter to you. And for more dedicated students of spirituality, these struggles and ordeals are what you want. You want these ordeals so that you can become more and more resilient to the dramas and difficulties of life. Because really, the consciousness itself has no preference towards things. It only perceives, and it does so with indifference and tranquility. This state of unconditioned consciousness is called samadhi. It is a state in which we perceive everything objectively, free from the distractions and defects like pride, hatred, lust, fear, addiction. Samadhi states are possible to attain in meditation for brief periods of time, and with more training, you can learn to access it regularly at will. Samadhi is the highest state of consciousness a person can experience in meditation. So if you manage to reach it at some point in your practice, you will receive enormous benefit. Your perception and understanding will be impeccable. Everything in your life will make sense, and you will rapidly accelerate your healing. Now, with all that being said, I should mention that you will not eliminate all of your pride and anger and sorrow and depression at once by doing this. This work is a process that requires successive comprehension. You may reach a point in which you've received all the insights and wisdom you needed, but still feel slight and occasional resentment or brooding. At this stage, you may have to just give your meditation practice a break and be content with what you received. I bring this up because this happened to me. I meditated so relentlessly on my trauma that I reached a point where I was told in meditation that my own defects of ruthlessness and anger were trying to kill themselves and other egos. So in other words, I was being ruthless in my practice. You have to realize that only consciousness and energy can eliminate defects. Defects do not extirpate other defects. So if you practice with excessive determination, stubbornness, frustration, and attachment, then you will likely struggle. In my case, I was already provided the answers I needed to move on. I was basically told in different ways to let go because it was the right thing to do. I understood this intellectually, but by persisting in meditation and asking for more help, this showed that I didn't comprehend it. What this means is, once you receive the answers you need, you have to actually follow them in order to progress. With this practice, you'll never have to find yourself looking back and considering asking your ex-partner, why did you do this and why did you say that? What was that all about? Because you will be able to find the answers yourself. So cherish your insights and keep referring back to them. Follow them, stick to them. They're true and they're beautiful. I will admit, letting go of traumas using transmutation is easier said than done. We lived our whole lives protecting our pride and always arguing and fighting back with people who mistreat us. But this is the old paradigm of mankind, and it has only made things worse. Nothing good can come out of revenge and violence and weapons. our problems are so pervasive that in this day and age, most of us have little choice but to liberate ourselves in a more conscious way. It wasn't until 7 years later when I finally discovered these healing practices, and adjusting to them wasn't easy either, because what I was doing wasn't part of my plan, and it felt really unconventional. Most people in the West just solve their problems on the spot by protecting their pride and complaining or retaliating against someone. But I had no choice but to become spiritual, since my problem was in the past and there was nothing I could do to change it. The counselor said that only I know what's right at the end of the day. They could not remove my stubborn pride from me. They could only give me support. But meditation, on the other hand, destroyed my defects of pride and anger. It was hard for me to get used to the idea that there was this miraculous way to heal from all types of psychological suffering. And if you don't like the phrase letting go, having to let go of something, really what you're doing is you're transmuting. You're transmuting impressions and you're comprehending. Transmutation means to change thoroughly. So when we're struggling with something like a trauma, our energy is blocked in different parts of the mind and body. When we transmute impressions, we use various exercises to move energy around, release tension, and transform negative emotions and thoughts into their lighter forms. And this can be done in many ways, as long as we are focusing our attention on the negative impressions and using the exercises to release tension. Activities like dancing, singing, shouting, exercising, listening to music, and making art are all conducive to unblocking and transmuting energy. But for people who are very serious about energy work and transmutation, more advanced and specialized practices have been provided to us by ancient religions like Hinduism. The most common and effective ones include Hatha Yoga, Pranayama, Dream Yoga, and meditation and prayer. And the highest and most sacred practices, Tibetan rites for rejuvenation, and Tantra. To learn these proper integral healing techniques, refer to my videos End Suffering, How to Meditate, or simply How to Meditate, and Meditation and the 8 Limbs of Yoga.